Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today, participating. My special guest today, probably many of you already know, but I'll introduce him anyway. His name is Piero Mastroberardino, and he is the proprietor, ciao Piero, proprietor and managing director of the famous Mastroberardino winery in Atripalda in Campania, specifically in Irpinia. Piero, thank you for this opportunity. And tell me how the weather is there and how the vineyards are looking so far in 2020.
Well, 2020 is very interesting for the vineyards. I mean, it's very good. We're having a great weather. We had beautiful weather in April and May. In all the period of the lockdown, we went on working in the vineyards because the weather was perfect for all the works of the vines. And even now, after a couple of weeks of less stability, now we have again 2 full weeks that are going to be of high pressure, and so perfect condition to go on with the work. And we had in the last days a little rain that was helpful to give a little refresh to the vineyards. So I think that the situation is very, very good at the moment. We only had one episode of a little frost in mid-April,
Okay.
but not too many damages. It was not too bad. So on the whole, it's doing well.
Good. And I've noticed too also that since we're in Irpinia, which I'm sure people know we're watching is inland in Campania, that you get a lot of rain there. You're surrounded by some small mountains. It really has its own specific climate, and what you get for weather is very different than what, say, Piemonte or Toscana would get, isn't it?
Yeah. Here in Irpinia, the microclimate is very, very specific, and it's different from what many people think about our latitude, because we are in the south,
right.
We are in the inland of Campania, and we are only 30 kilometers east of the Amalfi Coast. So in 20 minutes, you are at Vietri sul Mar, that is the beginning of the Amalfi Coast. But these 30 kilometers are all the way up to the mountains. So we've got about 7 Celsius degrees of difference.
Wow, that's a lot. Yeah.
On the average, it's a lot. It's a completely different environment. As you said, we've got high mountains around. It's a valley surrounded by mountains in the Apennine chain, right in the middle of the mountains. 30 minutes far from my house, I've got a ski place.
Really?
And
okay. Huh.
Yeah, but we've got snow in the vineyards every year. In January, sometimes at the beginning of February. We also, sometimes even in December, every year we have snow in the vineyard. That is very good for cleaning the soil, but it's even very important for the reserves of water in the soil.
Exactly. I would imagine if you showed someone that photo of the vineyards with snow and say, what region is this? Not many people would guess Campania. So, but I didn't know that. I've never seen that. So,
okay. Yeah, Campania is very well known for the coast. It's very well known for Napoli, Positano, Amalfi, and Mount Vesuvio and Pompeii, of course, and Capri. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful region for tourism, but it's also very interesting for wine tourism. And the wine tourism is mainly in the inland, so on the high hills, because that's the place where you have the best expression of the soil, the climate, and also the grape varietals, because all these wines take advantage of the fact that we are in high altitude with the biggest cushion of temperature between night and day. We got high acidity, and also we have this beautiful richness in minerals in the soil that gives, as you well know, because you're a lover of the region, we give this wine this kind of verticality that is a real distinctive character of all the wines of Irpinia.
Great. Well, we have a lot to talk about today. We have a full hour, and of course, we'll talk about your current releases, and you have a lot of different wines. I'm thinking that a lot of people know, your Taurasi, which is a world-class wine, and we'll spend a lot of time on that. But you have some terrific whites as well, which we'll talk about. But when we talk about Mastroberardino, I refer to it as the historic winery of Campania, and I want to talk a little bit about your family's history and also how Campania has changed over the last few years. So let me put up one photo here that you sent me. And if you could tell me what this is, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, this is our cellar where I'm currently, and where my house is. On the top of the cellar, we got our family house since 2 centuries ago. And so this is a picture of 1900, and it's a picture in which you got the workers in the cellar, and the structure of the cellar is exactly the same. In this position, we now have barricks for the wood refining. And in that period, you see that people used to build the barrels inside the winery. So there was not the specialization of work that we have today. So in the cellar, they used to produce the barrels and then to use them inside for both the wood aging and for transportation. The smaller ones that were called carati or carratelli were used for shipments,
Okay.
and the bigger ones for aging.
Now, you were established, the winery was established in Atripalda, in a small town in Irpinia, in 1878, correct?
Well, no, 1878 is the start of the export for my family, because the family started the business in the beginning of 1700. We got a museum that is dedicated to the history of the family here in the cellars, and in this museum, the oldest document dates back to 1735, and it's the first purchase of land in the village of Santo Stefano del Sole. That is a 5 minutes drive from our cellars, and it's a place where in this act we got a description of the cultivation that was in that piece of land, and in the description there is the fact that there were planted, the vines that were planted were of Fiano di Avellino. So I mean, it's a long story of, I mean, the heritage of these grapes, of course, goes back much in the past to the roots of the Greeks and the Romans. So it's 2,000 years ago. But even 3 centuries ago, we have a lot of documents that testify the continuity of production of these grapes and wines in this area.
Okay. Now, you mentioned 1878 was when you started the export business.
Yeah.
As best as you know, I know you weren't around then, but what was the wine industry like in Campania? Was it mostly growers? I mean, were there many other producers that were also exporting wine, or?
Yeah, it was mainly focused on growers, and not many wineries organized for the export. So my family was a kind of a pioneer, because in 1878 they decided to open some markets, and they founded a company in Rome that was a company that was able to ship the wines abroad. So from Rome they used to establish relationship with the Genoa port and with Venice. And so from Genoa and Venice, they tried to cover 2 different trajectories through Europe. And then from Genoa, there was the shipment to the North American market. So in the end of the 1800s, we got the opening of North America. Part of the family was in New York, part of Mastroberardino family.
Okay. I didn't know that. Okay.
And so some cousins of my great-grandfather used to live there. And so my great-grandfather took advantage of this, starting distributing the wines in the United States and in Canada through the friendship of this part of the family, and with the knowledge of many Italian people that were the first, emigrants from Italy that had already established some business there. So they were already introduced and integrated and in the social and economic life, and helped a lot my side of the family to distribute and promote the wines there. I got my grandfather, Michele Mastroberardino, that at the beginning of 1900s sends letters from New York on a regular basis, because he goes there every year, and he spends there a lot of months every year, and he describes his travels all around the United States and Canada, and in 20 days he covers 20 different cities by train. Each day is dedicated to a different town, so he visited New York, Boston, Buffalo, Syracuse, Philadelphia, and so on. I mean, and we got many description of these travels made throughout America at the time.
That's great. I would imagine that probably during Prohibition in the United States, that was
yes, we
kind
got,
of a disaster for your business, at least for North America. So
yes, in that period, in 1920, we've got still a good work in the United States. We got a contract of distribution, import and distribution, with a company that is based in New York.
okay.
The name is Louis Sachard, and this guy is the importer of Mastroberardino wines at the start of the Prohibition period. In 1921, my grandfather decides to open the Latin American markets in order to substitute the market that was going down in North America. And so we got Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, that become interesting markets for our company. But at the same time, in the United States, the shipments went on. I don't know how, but we still have shipments during the period of the 20s to the 30s.
Yeah.
And in the 1932, before the repeal of the Volstead Act, we got many companies from all over the United States writing to my family in order to reopen the business, because there was the announcement that Roosevelt was going to change the rules.
Exactly. And at this time, were you shipping, was it primarily red wine, only red wine, or was there also some white wine you were shipping?
Red wines, until the late 30s, red wines were probably about 75–80% of the job. And white wines were a small percentage, but very high class. So we got the Greco di Tufo that was called only Tufo. The name was only the geographic name at the time.
Okay.
And it was very successful in many countries abroad, and mainly in Europe. And Taurasi was extremely successful in America. In North America, in Central America, we got the distribution also in some countries in Central America since 1930, 1928. But in that period, we also cover Asian market. We go all the way to some Japan ports, some Chinese places. Chengdu is a destination of our wines in that period. I don't know how. and also some important cities of the Anglo-Indian Empire of that time were important destination for our wines. And also Africa was important, because in Africa we had many Italian colonies, and so we had a lot of states that were a destination for many entrepreneurs from Italy that used to go there in order to make a development of the areas. And so they also started, going through restaurants. Many people opened Italian restaurants in many African countries. And so we got a business even there in the 30s.
Great. Okay. I want to continue with history, and I'm going to put up a picture of one of your estates here. And I put this up because I want you to tell the story. Whoops. No, that's right. Yeah, okay. This is Montefusco for Greco di Tufo, see?
Yes.
And I don't have a picture of your father. I'm sorry. I met him a few times, your father, Antonio, but he really was one of the key figures in preserving this variety, wasn't he? And really, saving Campania and Irpinia with white wines. If you could tell that story.
Well, I must say that my father was probably the man that saved all the grapes and wines from this region, because his father, my grandfather, died in 1945,
okay.
More or less a few months before the end of World War II. And my father at the time was 17 years old. And so he became the chief of the company.
Right.
He was able to go on doing harvest every year, even during the war. In the last 3 years of the war, since 1943, my grandfather had problems with his eyes and was sick, so was suffering. So my father had to manage the problems of the war and the problem of the after war and the relaunch of the brand. At that time, many growers abandoned the vineyards for the war and for economic problems.
Of course.
And so my father went all around the area to convince people to join the project of Mastroberardino family to reimplant all the ancient vineyards of Greco, Fiano, and Aglianico, the three main grape varietals of the area. And so in the 50s, he was able to have again a small production of the three appellations, and he reopened important markets, starting from London, and from London then New York and Montreal. So North America was important again for our company, for our family, because in the late 50s, Taurasi became again an important message for Italian wine movement that was going under a renaissance process. In the 60s, we got a full legitimation of Taurasi in the US. So even now, you can still find many bottles from the 60s from our Taurasi in many important restaurants or in the cellars of collectors in the States. And I mean, those are bottles that were extremely important for the relaunch of not only Irpinia or Campania, but the whole Italian movement.
Yeah,
yes,
I love this photo that you sent me, these old bottles going back to 1928.
Yeah, I got one right here.
Oh, really?
That's the one.
And what's the vintage?
28.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I also have the one from the 30s. I got several bottles here that are a good sample of last century. Okay. And it's interesting because in every decade, tasting these bottles that are still extremely interesting and fresh, you have also an idea of the evolution of the style of the viticulture in the approach to winemaking.
Okay, we'll talk a lot more about Taurasi in the second half of the webinar, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about your father. So it's my understanding, you've told me before that, I mean, he really kind of took the bull by the horns, as the expression goes. And I mean, he really was the lead in this movement to revigorate and restore the vineyards. I mean, and he worked with many other growers in Irpinia, didn't he?
Yeah, yes, because he didn't want to have a result of, just the family and a territory. He remembered that in 1800s in the area of Irpinia, there was a big, important production of grapes since the period of Napoleone that was here dominator in the area in the beginning of 1800s up to 1810. And in that period, we had in Irpinia 20,000 hectares of vineyards, quality.
Wow.
In the late 1800s, we still have about 60,000 hectares in the area. So the vocation of the area to viticulture has always been extremely, important. And so he wanted to go back to the heritage of the area, and he didn't want to accept a contamination from different grape varietals, from the international grapes and wines. He wanted to have a continuity with the roots of the family and of the region, and that's why he made this cultural battle in order to relaunch all these grapes.
That's a good way to put it. So one question I was going to ask at the end, but since we're talking about your father, but I know you must take great pride. I've met him a couple of times. I was fortunate, and once with you, once on my own, and he was just full of charm and information, and just, you could tell he just, he's one of those people that couldn't wait to get up in the morning because he had so much on his mind. He wanted to do so much, and you must be very proud to be his son. But what are the best qualities that he instilled in you?
In me?
Yes.
Well, of course, a father, always talks about a son in the best way. But I think that the best qualities that we have in the family are from my father. I couldn't say anything different because he had the determination and motivation, and he was so strongly convinced. And he was an innovator with a big respect for the roots, but he was able to change things. I mean, all the things that I'm doing today, all the success that we are having with our wines comes from ideas that were, born in the mind of my father.
Okay.
Many things that we are doing now are still linked to his ideas. And this is for me an important tribute because this is something that, first of all, is true. And secondly, is important in a multi-generational family and company,
Yes.
because in the family business, the capability of every one of us to have a strong respect for what happens before you and a strong respect for what you have to do for the next generation is the best way to interpret this rule. And so even if my father and me, we had such a beautiful relationship. I mean, we had the perfect approach to the business together.
Mm-hmm.
I must say that I couldn't be better than him.
Okay. That's it. I like that answer. That's great. So I'm going to put the picture back up of Montefusco, and we'll start off with your white wines. Of course, you just mentioned the old bottles of Taurasi, and everybody wants to talk about that. And that's your one of your signatures, I should say. It might be your most famous signature, but you also produce some outstanding white wines, and people should know about these. And we'll start off with the two most famous whites of Irpinia. First with Greco di Tufo. Tell us about Greco di Tufo in general, about this particular estate, Montefusco. And
okay, this is a bottle of Greco di Tufo from the 60s.
Oh, okay. I remember that.
And, yeah, I must say that when in the 60s, we first said that in the 60s we had great legitimation with the Taurasi, so with the red wine from Irpinia. In the late 70s, we have a huge success in the whites of Irpinia, meaning Greco di Tufo on one side and Fiano di Avellino. This is a Fiano di Avellino from the same period.
Okay.
So these were the two white pillars of our viticulture, and they are completely different wine. Greco di Tufo was extremely successful in the late 70s and beginning of 80s because my father understood that the approach to cuisine and to food was changing. So people were looking more and more for a little lighter, more refined cuisine style, Italian cuisine style. They were looking for more dedication to fish, to seafood, more than meats. And so that things were changing in the diet. No? The Mediterranean diet was evolving and was going towards more and more, a light and refined and elegant style. So at that moment, we had an explosion of Greco di Tufo, because Greco di Tufo is a wine that has a very friendly, very open, character. I mean, Greco di Tufo compared to the Fiano di Avellino, that is a little more austere. Greco is open and friendly, is easy to pair with food, and I must say that was extremely helpful in that period because its possibility to food pairing was wider than a Fiano. So Greco became a really, I would say, kind of a visual hammer for the company. Before that period was Taurasi. In the late 70s and beginning of the 80s was Greco di Tufo. So Greco di Tufo became a very important message for all the winery and for all the territory of Campania, and became the white wine, the best known Italian white wine, for all the region, for all the country, and also abroad. And Fiano, at the same time, became successful as the most exclusive white. So Greco was an open message. Fiano was the high-scale white wine of the region. The wines are different, as you know. So Greco has a structure that is more similar to a red wine, and Fiano di Avellino is more refined and elegant. And so in the case of Greco, you have a great versatility. The case of Fiano, you must be a little more careful to the pairing with food, but they are both very interesting grapes and wines, completely different, as I said, both on viticultural side and in the cellars. Because in the vineyards, Greco has a behavior that is different when temperatures are different. So when it's when you have a warmer harvest, Greco can suffer more because of the skin that is a little thick and can have an evolution towards brown. That is a problem in enological terms. Fiano suffers less higher temperatures. So when in a vineyard you've got a perfect expression of Greco, sometimes you have a less performance in the Fiano, and vice versa.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, that's very interesting. They are produced in two wine regions that are one close to the other, one on the borders of the other. And Fiano is a little wider as an area, but with a lower level of exploiting of the soil. Okay. Greco is produced only in 8 small villages, but when you go there, you see vineyards everywhere.
Right. This, for people watching, this is a picture of the Santo Stefano del Sole,
yeah, exactly.
estate that you have. That we went up there, and this is where your best Fiano was produced, and it's just very wide open and it's pretty high up. What's the elevation here?
Yeah, the upper part of the estate is 650 meters.
Wow, wow.
Yeah. The same in Montefusco. Even Montefusco, the upper part of the estate is 650. So these are Montefusco is a little colder. Santo Stefano is a little more open on the valley, so you have a nice breeze coming from the valley. So this is perfect in terms of also sanity of the grapes, because in this area we are able to produce the grapes in the organic protocol due to this condition, this environmental condition. So the single vineyard that is produced in this estate, that is called Radici Fiano di Avellino, comes from organic viticulture.
Okay. And the current release on this is 2019, correct?
2019 was just released recently, because usually we release the cru line, the single vineyards in May.
Okay. Now, I was there last year with you and tasted the 2018 of the Radici Fiano and the Nova Serra Greco. And as you said, I'm a lover of these wines, and I think without any hesitation that these are probably, if not the best white wines in Italy, certainly right there at the top, with maybe a couple others. People think of Friuli and some other places, but I would rank these as best. And 2018 especially was, I just thought, a standing vintage. Maybe not the biggest, but in terms of just aromatic profile and finesse and varietal character, it was just a lovely vintage, and those wines will age a long time. How about 2019?
2019 is just a little better than 18, because it was a little more regular in the evolution of the weather during the year. So in the 19, we got a little more potential. And this is, of course, interesting for these wines, because as you know well, these are wines that love to be refined for a long period. So I mean, even if we have just released the 19, these are wines that start giving their best in 18 months. And and of course, both for Greco and for Fiano, you got a potential of aging that goes to 30, even 40 years. That for a white wine is not very common.
Yeah, I people can understand that, but it's almost like one of those things like you want to have somebody repeat that, because they say 30, 40 years, and but it really is true. And the amazing thing too about especially these two versions, they're not aged in oak. They see no wood. So people are, think of Chardonnays and they think of white Burgundies and things, and then they see these white wines from Campania, and they really can age for a long, long time. And the question I have that everybody asks, which one ages better?
Well, here it's difficult to say. Fiano usually ages a little better, but it's not a standard for all the vintages. It really depends on the vintages. On the average, I must say that Fiano that has an evolution that is a little more complex. The Greco is extremely interesting. You know that we have this new project that is called Stilema, where we produce both a Fiano di Avellino Stilema
Yes.
and a Greco di Tufo Stilema.
Greco. Okay. The Greco is new?
Greco is new, just released, yes. So for Fiano di Avellino, we released the 2016. For Greco di Tufo, we are releasing the 2017. So we are keeping in the cellar 1 year more the Fiano, usually 6-8 months more. We release the Greco a little earlier. The potential of aging for both these wines, I think, is extremely important and interesting. The evolution of Fiano, in my opinion, is a little more than the Greco, but we'll see, because this new project is based on the protocol of production of the Fiano di Avellino and Greco di Tufo that my father used to produce in the late 70s. So these are wines that are thought for the long aging. Okay. So we have the Cru line that is dedicated to a little younger wines, but the Stilema line is made for aging. And we release these wines after 3-4 years from the harvest.
Okay, and these wines do see a little bit of wood aging, correct?
Just a 10% of the blend goes through wood, but it's very, very light. I mean, you cannot perceive it in the tasting. It's only for giving a little more volume and texture.
Okay. And you produce another Fiano, and the times we've met, you know how much I love this wine, and I wish it was imported in the United States. But it's called Fiano di Avellino. It's called More Maiorum.
Yes,
kind of loosely translates as like as the ancients used to do. Yes, in that style. I wish, you know, that your new importer Taub is bringing a lot of your wines, and I'm sure they're going to do a great job for you. And I can't bring it in everything, but so I have to go to Campania. It's an excuse for me to go to Campania to try it. But if you could tell people about that wine, because it is so distinctive. It is one of the most unique white wines anywhere in the world.
Well, More Maiorum is another project that I personally started in the mid-90s. The first vintage of More Maiorum is 1995. And in that period, we just had the explosion of the whites that were completely without wood, that were based on the freshness, on the fruit. And More Maiorum was a complete change of approach, because it was a wine that was released after 4 years. And in these 4 years, we had a period of about 1 year in wood. And then after wood, we have a long period of refining in bottle. Currently, the current vintage of More Maiorum is 2015. Okay. So we are releasing it even later, after 5 years. And it has a little fermentation in wood and then a little refining in wood. And it's a single vineyard as well. And it's a wine that has a completely different style and character, because the micro-oxygenation that happens in barriques, of course, gives a different, makes the Fiano a little more sumptuous, a little richer.
Right, and I always remember sort of a honey or kind of a waxy quality to it, which really, you know, the Fiano, the Radici always has that beautiful bright fruit, that pear and some local fruits, but that honey, that beeswax sort of character to it, that really made that wine stand out. So how many bottles of that do you produce?
More Maiorum, it really depends on the harvest, but usually it's about 4,000 bottles per year.
Okay. We could talk about, you can tell I love these wines, so, but we have to talk about Aglianico and Taurasi. So before we talk about Taurasi, let's talk about, I'll put up a picture here of one of your great estates, and we'll talk about Aglianico and what that grape means to you, and the different styles you can produce with Aglianico. This is a picture, I love this picture of the Monte Marano estate, that's in the southern part of the Taurasi DOCG, correct?
Yes, it's the southern part that is also the coldest, the highest, the closest to the mountains. And so it's it's the area in which the weather is severe and rigid, and It's typical Irpinia, because in the northern part we got more hilly environment. In the southern part of Taurasi appellation, we got all these high mountains, and we got the vineyards that go all the way to the mountains, close to the mountains. So we got a little colder temperature, and also the period of harvest is later than the one in the northern part. So we got in the two areas of the same appellation two completely different styles of Aglianico grapes for Taurasi. These are the typical expression of our Taurasi Radici. That is our, I would say, our flagship. Is probably the best known label of my family.
Right.
And here it is in the Riserva version. And
Radici, as I'm sure everyone knows, in Italian means roots. So that's roots. a great testament to your family's history.
Yeah, this is the one of the wines that made the success, the renaissance of Italian wines in the 80s all over the world, starting in the 80s. And Aglianico is considered the monarch, the king of our viticulture. And as I said, I mean, many people don't even imagine that in this region we are the last viticulture to harvest all over Italy. We start with the whites in the middle of October, and we end with the Aglianico grapes on about November 10, usually. So this means that we have
it is late.
strong... Pardon?
I said that is late, yes.
Yeah, wow. It is late. It is late. It is late. This is an opportunity and also a threat. An opportunity because you have the period of maturation that comes later than any other part of Italy. So we don't suffer too much the very hot climate in August, because in that period we are not at the peak of the maturation. The peak comes in September when the environment is much fresher. In our area in September, we got very cold temperatures at night. So this is perfect to keep a slower maturation and to bring the grapes in good condition at the period of the picking. Right. But on the other hand, we got the risk of the month of October that can be rainy. If it's if we got a lot of rain in October, we cannot produce our big Taurasi. And so we don't produce these wines every year. I mean, we couldn't produce any bottle of Taurasi in the 2002, but we did not produce any bottle of our Riserva of Radici Taurasi, both in the 2010 and in the 2013. So when October is rainy, we can have problems with these wines.
Okay.
But it's something that is part of the job anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, you're working with Mother Nature. You have no choice, right?
Exactly.
I put up a picture here of your Mirabella Eclano estate, which is, and also that's in the Taurasi DOCG, and you make some of your best Taurasi from there. But one other white I didn't mention, and you have this grape planted there, is Falanghina.
Yes. Before going to Falanghina, I will say a few words about two crus that are produced in Mirabella as well, in this estate, and they are produced from Aglianico. And one is our Blanc de Noir. It's a very, very tiny production. It's called the Nero a Metà, and it's released usually 1 year later than the other whites. So the current release is 2018 and was just released a few weeks ago. And the other is Redimore, that is an Aglianico Irpinia DOC, and it's a single vineyard that is produced in this estate, and it's very important because it comes from a Prephyloxera clone that has been selected from a very old vineyard. So Redimore is another very interesting wine because it's a little younger. We are now releasing the 2018, a little younger than a Taurasi, but has a complexity of a Taurasi without having the long aging. So it's a little more approachable. It's perfect for a T-bone steak pairing. I mean, it's not complex as a Taurasi, but it's a great wine as well. The wine you were mentioning is Falanghina, and in that estate of Mirabella, we produce the Mora Bianca single vineyard Irpinia DOC Falanghina. Falanghina is the fourth grape that we have in the area that has an importance and a relevance, because it's a great white wine as Fiano and Greco. Probably it's not ageable as Fiano and Greco, but it's extremely interesting in terms of enological issues, because if it's produced with a high density of plantation, with a low yield per plant, with the correct approach to the vineyard, you can have a wine that has complexity, that has a beautiful, beautiful expression of fruit. And so Falanghina is, I think, extremely intriguing. You got this kiwi, green apple flavors. I mean, it's extremely interesting wine.
Yeah, I think this is, I love that particular Falanghina. I love Falanghina in general, but until about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the only thing you heard about Falanghina was that, well, it had a lot of very high acidity, and which was kind of a backward compliment, like, well, okay, it's got the acidity, but there wasn't much fruit there. And this is one of the things that's not talked about much with Campania in general, because Falanghina is in all the provinces, not just in Irpinia, it's in Caserta, it's in Benevento, that producers have really done a lot of work, a lot of research into Falanghina, and have made this into a wine of much greater complexity than what we used to see 15 years ago.
The main issue is the one that I mentioned, is the choices in the vineyard management. Because traditionally in the past, Falanghina had a very high yield, and so at the end, the wine, the grapes were not able to come to a perfect maturation. So you had a very green wine with not a good balance.
Right.
But changing the approach to viticulture, starting in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, we had the first results in the late 90s of changing of the approach to Falanghina. Falanghina was considered in the past the everyday wine for Campania families, while Greco or Fiano were the big wines. Currently, things have changed, because now Falanghina is an important wine and can be enjoyed even with important food.
Okay, great. Well, we have a little more than 15 minutes left, and the Taurasi is such a big subject with you. So let's talk about that. So you have several different examples of Taurasi. You showed the black label, the Radici, and then the Radici Reserva, the white label. And then you have a wine that you started making. You tell me when you started making it, but it's the Naturalist Storia.
Yeah. Well, Radici started as a project at the end of the 70s, and we have the first vintage of Radici in 1986.
Okay.
Historia is a new project that comes a little later, and so the first release of Naturalist Historia was 1997. And the approach was different, because in the case of Radici Taurasi, the approach was more on the traditional barrels than the French barriques. While in the case of Naturalist Historia, in the late 90s, we decided to make an experiment with a Taurasi elevated only in the small barrels.
Okay.
And so this is one of the differences. The second difference comes from the terroir, because as you said, Mirabella is in the northern part, so hilly, and so we harvest 1 week earlier. We have a little more softness, more roundness in Naturalist Historia than the character, compared to the character that we have in Radici, that are a little deeper, a little darker, and so the style of Radici Taurasi is a little more masculine expression of Taurasi compared to Naturalist Historia. It is a little more delicate. And in the long run, the wines age perfectly, because we are seeing in the vertical tasting in parallel that the wines have a beautiful evolution in parallel. So both of them have a very, very long life. As I said, Taurasi has this unique characteristic. It's a red wine that you can enjoy after 1 century. After 1 century, you're still having the freshness and the character of the grape varietal. It is outstanding. When we open a bottle from the 20s or the 30s, we are still there tasting the bouquet of the grape. That's really unique. This comes from a very high content of polyphenol. As you know, the tannins are extremely important in Aglianico. And so here there's an important impact of the approach of the culturer, because the maceration process becomes strategic in the approach to wine. So if you want to have a wine with a little higher concentration of the fruit, with a little, more vivid color, you will have a maceration that can be up to 25 days easily, and you can have, the expression of our Radici Taurasi with this typical color that has the, the
Okay, here we go.
ruby notes. But at the same time, we are experimenting something different. In the Stilema project, this is the new Stilema Taurasi that has been just released.
The vintage of that is Anata?
Is 2015.
Okay.
And in the Stilema project, the difference is in the fact that here I am trying to go back to the style of the great vintages of Taurasi from the 60s. This is the legend 68.
Oh, the famous 68, yes.
Yes, in the under appellation Montemarano, 1968. And in the case of Stilema, we are not going towards the style of the Taurasis that you well know, that our consumer well know, but in the style of the 60s. That means a shorter maceration with a little lower temperature, less extraction, more agility in the glass, a little more transparency. The wine is more played on elegance and finesse, a little less on the extract and concentration. So in this case, we will have in the glass a little more transparency, and at the nose and on the palate, much more on the spices and less on the fruit. So we are trying to give our consumer a little wider idea of the terroir of Taurasi and the different possibilities of expression of this grape in this area.
I think that's great marketing, and I think that's great for not only for you, but for all the producers of Taurasi in general, to get that out there. It's just there's been, considering the quality of the wine, just not the amount of publicity and in the press that the wine deserves. But on the Naturalis Historia, is that the same vintage? The current Radici is 2016. Is the Naturalis also 2016?
No, the Naturalis Historia goes as a vintage with the Riserva. So currently it's the 2014.
Okay. And I remember
the Riserva and the Historia are 2014. The black label of Radici Taurasi is now 2016.
Okay, thank you. And I remember just after you first made Naturalis Historia, and I had an appointment with your father, and I tasted the wine for the first time, and he was talking about, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically, we can make new wines, but with the same varieties, with the same ancient varieties. And he didn't say it, but it's like, we don't need Merlot. We don't need Cabernet Sauvignon. We have Aglianico, and we can make many different styles of wine from that. And I'm sure everyone watching knows this, but I mean, it's the Campania of all the regions in Italy, maybe Sardinia or Friuli or something, but there's more indigenous varieties there. And it's just so refreshing to try these wines. I think that's one of the reasons I love going there, is that I'm not going to try a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Merlot or a Chardonnay. I don't even think there's a single Chardonnay vine in the region, is there?
Yes, and then you have to consider also that research and literature on the big international grapes, of course, is strong and wide, while when you have grape varietals that you can find only in one very small wine region, like in our case, research is usually based on the approach of the viticulturer. And so research is made inside the winery, inside the family business. And so you have so many things to explore on these grapes and wines that they are really the border of innovation in the viticulture and winemaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now let's talk about the 2016, since that's the current vintage of the Radici. So how does that vintage shape up? I just tried it this morning. To me, it's a little more little more structure than the 15. Wine probably has a little bit greater aging potential, but and of course, aging potential for your Radici could be 40, 50 years at least. So, but tell us about 2016, about that growing season and about the wine.
Compared to the 2015 was an excellent vintage, perfect for enological issues in the cellars because grapes were perfect. We didn't have any rain during the strategic periods, and so in the cellars we really had to do very few things. 2016 was a little more complicated because we had some rain, even in late September, and so we have a wine that when the grapes arrive at the cellar, we don't have the same big impact of the 15, but this means that during the elevation process for Taurasi, this is even better because Taurasi prefers to have the typical Irpinian weather. So when you have a situation that has some rain, that has lower temperatures, and sometimes can be a little more problematic for the maturation of the grapes, if you are able to bring the grapes to the cellars without problems of sanity, at the end you will start a process of elevation, and so the process of aging with a better, in a better way, and with better conditions. So in the case of 2016, I agree with you. I think that 16 has a bigger potential of aging compared to the 15, even if the weather was a little more complicated than the one that we had in the previous vintage. So this means that the wines that we have in Irpinia prefer to have the typical Irpinian weather to give their best.
Okay. Now, I know there's, I looked at the people that are watching here live today, and there'll be people watching when I record this and put it on YouTube, but many people that are watching are enormous fans of your Radici Taurasi and sometimes the Reserve as well. And they have several vintages in their cellar. So if you could tell us a little bit about recent vintages, maybe this decade and maybe some of the wines from the 2000s, what they should look for, what vintages, of course, I know you love them all, but what vintages you think will age the longest?
Well, first of all, I would say that the legendary vintages for Taurasi were 58, 61, 68, and then we have 71 and 77. Then we have 85. These are vintages that are great for collectors, up to 85. Then coming to the last decades, I would suggest, I love 2004. That is a very interesting harvest. We only produced 4,000 bottles of the Riserva, so it's very difficult to find that wine, but that wine was elected the best wine of Italy in that year.
Oh, great.
And it's extremely elegant. It's a great expression of Taurasi. That's the wine that I would love to produce every year, just to make it clear.
Right.
But at the same time, I would say that going back, we have the 99 that was very interesting and fresh. 99 has a style and nuances of eucalyptus and little mint is extremely refreshing. 98 is a very successful harvest for us. And we still are proposing some 98 in the big verticals that is doing great. And 1990 also was a very interesting vintage.
Okay.
So these are for sure harvests that deserve to be in the cellars.
Well, I'm sorry, that's one that's in my cellar that I went to a different view here, but that's the 2008, which you talk to other producers and they say, you know, well, 2010 was an excellent vintage, but 2008 was even better. So I was going to say, you know, when the COVID-19 is over, but this wine will age longer than that. So I'm not sure when I'll drink it, but I look forward to it. But how about 2008? How was that vintage?
Well, 2008, I didn't mention 2008 just because it's a little young in the approach to Taurasi. It's still a little young, but 2008 is an extraordinary harvest for us. In fact, I dedicated all the Riserva of 2008 to the memory of my father. So the Riserva of 2008 is only with the label Antonio Mastroberardino on it, and with the portrait that I made and dedicated to his memory. that is on the label. So it's a special edition, and was extremely successful for us, and had the huge scores everywhere in the world. So 2008 for sure is a great vintage in the history of Taurasi.
Okay, well, I've got some other wines I can drink in a few months. I'll hang on to that for a while. So, okay. Let me just put up, as we got about 5 minutes left, I'll put up a few pictures of your cellar, and people haven't been there. If they need any more reasons to visit, just take a look at this cellar. It's absolutely just gorgeous.
Yes, this is the labyrinth of the grottas that was used in 1943 as a refugee against the bombings. When the Allies arrived to make the Germans escape, the family and the friends of the family of the village, they all refuged in these grottas to protect themselves. And then it was in late September 1943. And then on October 3, my father, that was 15 years old, writes a letter to his brother that was under the army and describes the bombings. We got this letter that is displayed in our museum. And at the end, he says, we went out on October 3 and we were able to do our harvest even in 1943.
That's great. That's great. Here's a picture. If they look at that picture, they see the ceiling, you have murals, and there's a picture I took that is a detail of one of the murals. It's kind of like your own little Sistine Chapel, if I'm not being sacrilegious here, but it's just really a very stunning artwork. These are local artists? Or?
No, this is not Italian. We have many artworks in the cellars and in many parts of the cellar, both in the caveau and in the grottas. And this fresco was made by Doina Botas, that is a Romanian artist.
Okay, interesting. And then also, I have to mention that you recently opened in the winery a museum.
Yeah, museum that is dedicated. Yeah, it's called MIMA, M-I-M-A. That means Museo d'Impresa Mastroberardino Atripalda, and it's dedicated to the evolution of the history of the family, but also the evolution of the wine business, because it covers 3 centuries, and in these 3 centuries, we got so many documents talking about what happens in the world, all over the world in the wine business, due to the fact that my family used to travel since the 1800s all over the world to promote those wines. So it's really plenty of documents and plenty of experiences, and also things, objects, books that were sometimes bought during the travels and then brought back to the family. So it's really a very interesting destination in terms of wine tourism, to understand a little more about what happened in the 1800s and in the beginning of 1900s in the evolution of taste and the evolution of the business. You have the description of what happens in the different markets, what is made through restaurants, what is made through shops, and also you have the description in the letters of my ancestors of the big cities. So it describes New York, it describes Buenos Aires, it describes São Paulo del Brasile. So in each of these travels, we got these people that used to send information to the family to make them understand what was happening on the other side of the world.
Interesting. And at the winery too, I mean, you're right in the town of Atripalda. You're not out in the countryside, but the vineyards are out in the countryside, but the winery is right in the city. And you have a beautiful shop where people can find, especially a lot of these wines we talked about, like More Maiorum or Stilema, that are not, imported in the United States. So I highly recommend that. So this was great. And I'm always looking when I do these things for questions, and we got no questions today. And I realized, having done this a while, that's a good thing, because that means that people were absorbed by this presentation. And I don't think it was because of me. I think it was because of you. You're very entertaining and engaging, and you have a lot of information. And people are fascinated by your wines, and I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, because I know that you really do a great job to make people know more about Irpinia, that is such a small wine region. And so it's very important for us to even make people understand a little more, and maybe make them come to visit the area, because the best way to understand the flavors of this wine is to put the hands in the soil.
Agreed. So fingers crossed for a great harvest in 2020. And thank you again. And I certainly hope to see you very soon again in Irpinia. So
thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Ciao.
Ciao. See you soon.